The salt-stained charts spread across the wooden table trembled in the flickering candlelight as Christopher Columbus traced his weathered finger along the theoretical western route to the Indies. It was the spring of 1491, and the Genos navigator sat in the modest chambers of Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II of Spain, his voice barely containing the fervor that had consumed him for nearly a decade. "Your Majesties," Columbus declared, his eyes blazing with conviction, "while the Portuguese sail east around Africa's treacherous cape, we can reach the spice markets of Cathay and Chipangu. By sailing west across the ocean sea, the earth is smaller than scholars claim, and the riches of the Orient lie merely 3,000 miles beyond the Canary Islands." The royal couple exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the weight of decision. Spain had recently completed the Reconquista with the fall of Granada in January of 1492, expelling the last Moorish forces from Iberian soil. The kingdom's coffers, though strained by centuries of warfare, now looked toward new horizons for prosperity and glory. Queen Isabella, her auburn hair crowned, with determination, leaned forward. The recent reports from Portuguese explorers under Vasco da Gama had reached Spanish courts, describing successful ventures around the Cape of Good Hope. Spain could not afford to fall behind in the race for eastern riches. According to historical accounts preserved in the archive of the Indies in Seville, Columbus had already faced rejection from the Portuguese court of King John II, who deemed his calculations fundamentally flawed. The navigator's estimates of the Earth's circumference were indeed incorrect, influenced by the miscalculations of ancient geographer Ptolemy and the more recent, but equally inaccurate assertions of Pierre Daly. "The learned men of Salamanca have questioned your theories," King Ferdinand interjected, his voice carrying the caution of a ruler who had learned the cost of hasty decisions. "They claim the Western Ocean extends far beyond your estimates." Columbus straightened, his conviction unwavering. "Your Majesty, I have studied the works of Marco Polo, who described lands rich beyond imagination. I have consulted the maps of Paolo Toscanelli, who confirms the feasibility of this western passage. The winds themselves conspire in our favor, blowing steadily from east to west in the southern latitudes." The chamber fell silent except for the distant sounds of the Spanish court, conducting its daily business. Outside, the recently conquered city of Granada still bore the scars and celebrations of Christian victory. The timing seemed providential to Columbus, who had waited 3 years of war for this moment. Isabella's financial advisors had warned of the expedition's costs, but the potential rewards tantalized the Spanish crown. A successful western route to Asia would grant Spain unprecedented access to silk, spices, gold, and precious stones, breaking the monopoly held by Italian city-states and their eastern trade networks. "What do you require for this venture?" the Queen finally asked, her voice revealing the first hint of genuine interest. Columbus had prepared for this moment. 3 vessels, Your Majesty, with provisions for 1 year. 90 men of skill and courage, and recognition as Admiral of the Ocean Sea upon successful completion of the voyage. The die was cast. History would remember this spring evening in 1492 as the moment when European exploration took its most consequential turn westward. Though none present could foresee the civilizations that would collide, the empires that would rise and fall, or the continents that would be forever changed by this single decision made in a Spanish palace. The morning sun of August 3rd, 1492, cast long shadows across the harbor of Palos de la Frontera as Christopher Columbus surveyed his modest fleet. The 3 vessels that would carry European civilization to an unknown world bobbed gently in the Andalusian port, their crews making final preparations for a journey that would either bring unprecedented glory or consign them all to the depths of the Atlantic. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, stood proudly at the center of the formation. This sturdy carrack, measuring approximately 100 feet in length, represented the pinnacle of 15th-century maritime technology. Her high castle structures fore and aft provided commanding views of the sea, while her deep hull could carry sufficient provisions for the anticipated voyage to the Indies. Martin Alonso Pinzon, the respected local mariner whose reputation had helped Columbus recruit his crew, captained the swift caravel Pinta, renowned for her speed and maneuverability. The smallest vessel, the Nina, commanded by Vicente Yanes Pinzon, completed the expedition, originally rigged with lateen sails in the Mediterranean fashion. She had been converted to square rig configuration in the Canary Islands to better handle the anticipated ocean crossing. These 3 ships, carrying a total of 87 men, represented humanity's boldest attempt to breach the Western Ocean's mysterious expanse. Columbus had spent the previous months securing crews, a task complicated by sailors' natural fear of the unknown. Rumors persisted of sea monsters dwelling in the ocean sea's depths, boiling waters near the equator, and edges of the world where ships might plunge into endless void. The navigator's conviction and the Pinzon brothers' endorsement eventually overcame these superstitions, though not without significant effort, as documented in Columbus's own journal. Preserved in the Biblioteca Nacional de Espapa, the expedition's provisions included wine, hardtack, salt pork, dried legumes, olive oil, vinegar, and cheese sufficient for several months at sea. The ships also carried trade goods intended for Asian markets, including glass beads, brass rings, small bells, and colored cloth that Europeans believed would appeal to Eastern merchants. The crew represented a cross-section of Spanish maritime society. Experienced sailors worked alongside young adventurers seeking fortune, while craftsmen, soldiers, and even a few criminals granted royal pardons in exchange for service joined the expedition. Among them was Luis de Torres, a converted Jew who spoke Hebrew, Arabic, and some Aramaic, chosen because Columbus expected to encounter these languages in eastern lands. "Today we depart for the Indies," Columbus announced to his assembled crew, his voice carrying across the harbor as townspeople gathered to witness the historic departure. "We sail in service of their Catholic majesties and for the greater glory of Christendom. The riches of Cathay await, and we shall be the first to claim them for Spain." The morning tide began to turn, and the harbor master signaled the fleet's departure. One by one, the vessels weighed anchor and caught the favorable wind. The Santa Maria led the formation out of Palos Harbor, her banner displaying the royal arms of Castile and Leon alongside Columbus's personal coat of arms, recently granted by Queen Isabella Dodd as the Spanish coastline faded behind them. The three ships set course for the Canary Islands, their final stop before venturing into the uncharted Atlantic. The crew members watched their homeland disappear, many wondering if they would ever see familiar shores again. Columbus, standing on the Santa Maria's quarterdeck, felt the weight of history settling upon his shoulders. The age of exploration had begun in earnest, though the navigator and his men believed they were merely seeking a shorter route to known lands. None could imagine that their westward course would lead not to the spice markets of Asia, but to continents whose very existence remained beyond European comprehension, setting in motion events that would reshape the entire world. The endless, blue expanse of the Atlantic stretched before Columbus's fleet as they departed the Canary Islands. On September the 6th, 1492, the familiar landmarks of the known world had vanished behind them, leaving only the vast ocean sea that no European had successfully crossed. The three ships sailed into waters where ancient mapmakers had written "Here be dragons," and where the very concept of land beyond the horizon challenged every assumption about the world's geography. Columbus maintained the logs during the voyage, a practice that would prove both wise and controversial. In his private journal, he recorded accurate distances and observations, while in the logs shared with his crew, he deliberately understated the distances traveled to prevent panic. As they sailed farther from home than any expedition in recorded history, this deception reflected the navigator's understanding of his men's psychology and the unprecedented nature of their journey. The first weeks passed with favorable winds and calm seas, a blessing that Columbus attributed to divine providence. The trade winds, blowing steadily from the northeast, pushed the small fleet westward at a consistent pace. The weather remained remarkably cooperative, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that allowed the crew to maintain their spirits and routines. By late September, however, signs of unrest began to emerge among the sailors. The anticipated 3-week journey to the Indies had already exceeded that time frame, and no land appeared on the horizon. Seaweed began accumulating around the ships, which some crew members interpreted as evidence of nearby land, while others feared it indicated dangerous shallows or supernatural barriers. Martin Alonso Pinzon, commanding the Pinta, proved invaluable in maintaining crew morale. His reputation among Spanish sailors and his unwavering support for the expedition helped counter growing murmurs of discontent. When sailors gathered in small groups to whisper about turning back, Pinzon's presence reminded them of their duty to the crown and their potential rewards. The crew's concerns intensified as they observed strange phenomena. Flocks of birds appeared periodically, flying in directions that seemed to offer no clear indication of land. The compass needle began showing variations from true north, a magnetic declination that terrified sailors who relied on the instrument. For navigation, Columbus, drawing upon his extensive experience, explained these variations as natural phenomena, though privately he worried about their implications. According to maritime records held in the Casa de Contratation archives, the expedition encountered their first major crisis around October the 10th. The crew's patience had reached its breaking point, and several sailors approached Columbus with demands to abandon the westward course. The provisions, while still adequate, showed signs of depletion, and the psychological strain of sailing beyond all known boundaries had begun affecting the men's judgment. "Admiral," one of the senior sailors declared, his voice carrying the weight of collective frustration, "we have sailed farther than any Christian men before us. The Indies cannot lie at such a distance, and we risk our lives continuing this course. We must turn back while we still have supplies to reach Spain." Columbus faced the defining moment of his expedition. His calculations, based on erroneous estimates of the Earth's size, had promised land within a time frame that had already passed. Yet his conviction remained unshaken, supported by subtle signs that trained navigators could interpret as indicating nearby land. "Give me 3 more days," Columbus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the request. "If we sight no land within 3 days, we shall consider turning back. But I believe we are close to our destination, and the glory of Spain hangs in the balance." The compromise satisfied the crew temporarily, though tension remained high. As the ships continued westward through the night of October the 11th, lookouts strained their eyes toward the horizon, knowing that the next dawn might determine whether they would be remembered as heroes or fools. The ocean sea kept its secrets, but history was approaching its moment of revelation. The pre-dawn darkness of October the 12th, 1492, enveloped Columbus's fleet as they sailed through waters no European had ever navigated. The 3 ships maintained their westward course under a canopy of stars, their crews rotating through watches while maintaining constant vigilance for any sign of the land that had eluded them for over a month. The tension aboard each vessel had reached its peak. As the promised 3-day deadline approached its conclusion, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, stood at his post in the ship's bow, scanning the horizon as the first hints of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky behind them. The morning watch had begun, and the lookouts took their positions with the same mixture of hope and resignation that had characterized the previous weeks. The ocean sea stretched endlessly before them, offering no indication that this day would differ from the 35 that had preceded it. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, as the moon cast its pale light across the Atlantic swells, Rodrigo's trained eye detected something that made him pause. A subtle change in the horizon's appearance, a darkness that seemed different from the endless water they had grown accustomed to seeing. He stared intently, waiting for the next swell to lift the pinnace high enough to confirm his observation. "Tierra, tierra," Rodrigo's voice shattered the pre-dawn quiet, his cry of "land, land," echoing across the water between the 3 ships. The sound of his voice carried the weight of discovery, relief, and vindication for an expedition that had tested the limits of human courage and conviction. Columbus, awakened by the commotion aboard the Santa Maria, rushed to the deck and trained his spyglass toward the western horizon. The unmistakable silhouette of land appeared in the distance, confirming what every man in the fleet had desperately hoped to see. The navigator fell to his knees in prayer, his voice carrying across the water as he offered thanks to the Almighty for delivering them safely to their destination. The 3 ships approached the landfall cautiously as dawn broke fully, revealing a tropical island covered with lush vegetation and surrounded by crystal-clear waters. Palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze, and white sand beaches stretched along the shoreline. This was not the golden roofs and marble palaces that Marco Polo had described in his accounts of Cathay, but land nonetheless, offering rest, fresh water, and vindication of Columbus's theories. As recorded in the official account preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, Columbus led a landing party ashore in his ship's boat, carrying the royal banner of Castile and Leon. The moment his feet touched the sandy beach, he claimed the island for their Catholic majesties, planting the Spanish flag and naming the land San Salvador in honor of Christ the Savior, who had delivered them safely across the ocean sea. The landing party soon encountered the island's inhabitants, a people the Europeans would later call Indians, based on Columbus's conviction that he had reached the outer islands of the Indies. These indigenous people, members of the Taino culture, approached the newcomers with curiosity rather than hostility, offering gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and other local products in exchange for the glass beads and brass items the Spanish had brought as trade goods. Columbus observed these people with intense interest, noting their physical appearance, their apparent gentleness, and their lack of iron weapons or tools. In his journal, he described them as very well-formed people, with handsome bodies and very fine faces, though he also noted their potential value as servants and their likely ease of conversion to Christianity. The navigator's conviction that he had reached the eastern shores of Asia remained unshaken by the reality of what he had discovered. The island clearly did not match the descriptions of wealthy Asian cities, but Columbus reasoned that he had reached the outer territories of the Indies, and that the great cities of Cathay and Chipangu lay somewhere nearby among the numerous islands he could see dotting the horizon. The landing on San Salvador marked the beginning of sustained contact between the old and new worlds. Though neither side understood the full implications of this moment, Columbus believed he had achieved his goal of reaching Asia by sailing west, while the Taino people had no concept of the vast continent that lay beyond their ocean home, or the civilizations that would soon follow in the wake of these three small ships. Christopher Columbus spent several days exploring the island he had named San Salvador, studying its inhabitants and resources while planning his next moves in what he firmly believed were the outer territories of the Indies. The Taino people who lived on the island demonstrated remarkable hospitality toward these strange visitors, who had arrived from beyond the horizon in their great floating vessels. Though neither group could have imagined the profound consequences of their encounter, the indigenous people of San Salvador lived in a sophisticated society that had flourished in the Caribbean for centuries. They practiced agriculture, cultivating cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes, while their skilled craftsmen produced intricate pottery, woven textiles, and carved wooden artifacts. Their villages, organized around central plazas, reflected a complex social structure led by caciques, or chiefs, who governed through consensus and tradition, rather than the European concepts of absolute monarchy. Columbus observed these people through the lens of his medieval European worldview, seeing potential converts to Christianity and subjects for the Spanish crown, rather than representatives of an ancient and complex civilization. In his journal, he noted their apparent lack of iron weapons and their generous nature, writing that they would make fine servants and could be easily converted to the Christian faith. The exchange of gifts between the two groups established patterns that would characterize European indigenous relations throughout the Americas. The Spanish offered glass beads, brass bells, and red cloth caps, items that held little intrinsic value in European markets but fascinated the Taino people with their foreign origin and unusual properties. In return, the indigenous people presented parrots, cotton thread, wooden spears, and other products of their island home, as documented in the journal of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, who later transcribed and preserved Columbus's original log. The navigator immediately began searching for evidence of the gold and spices he expected to find in Asian territories. When he saw that some Taino individuals wore small gold ornaments in their noses, he became convinced that significant gold deposits existed somewhere in the region. Through gestures and broken communication, Columbus learned that the gold came from islands to the south and west. The Taino people spoke of a large island they called Cuba, which Columbus interpreted as a possible reference to Chipangu, the Japanese island that Marco Polo had described as being rich in gold and precious stones. This information reinforced his conviction that he had reached the eastern edge of Asia. After several days of exploration and gift exchange, Columbus decided to continue his search for the wealthy cities of Asia. He convinced several Taino individuals to join his expedition as guides and interpreters, a decision that would prove crucial for navigation among the Caribbean islands, but also marked the beginning of indigenous involvement in European exploration. Often under circumstances that amounted to coercion or kidnapping, the fleet departed San Salvador on October the 14th, island hopping through the Bahamas as Columbus searched for the mainland of Asia, or the golden cities described in medieval travel accounts. Each island they encountered revealed similar patterns: indigenous peoples living in well-organized societies, small amounts of gold jewelry indicating larger deposits elsewhere, and tropical abundance that impressed the European visitors but fell short of the fabulous wealth they sought. On October the 28th, the expedition reached the large island of Cuba, which Columbus initially believed might be the mainland of Cathay itself. The size and complexity of this island, with its deep harbors, extensive coastline, and numerous indigenous settlements, seemed to match descriptions of Asian territories. However, exploration of the Cuban coast revealed no great cities or obvious signs of the advanced civilization that European accounts of Asia had led him to expect. The cultural exchange during these first weeks established precedents that would influence centuries of European colonial activity. The Europeans' superior military technology, particularly their steel weapons and armor, gave them significant advantages in conflicts, while their horses and ships provided mobility that indigenous peoples could not match. Conversely, the indigenous people's knowledge of local geography, weather patterns, and resources proved invaluable for European survival and exploration. Columbus's conviction that he had reached Asia persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The flora and fauna of the Caribbean islands differed markedly from Asian descriptions. The indigenous peoples showed no knowledge of the Great Khan of Cathay, and no cities comparable to those described by Marco Polo appeared anywhere in the region, yet the navigator's preconceptions proved remarkably resistant to contrary evidence, and he continued to interpret his discoveries within the framework of his original theory about reaching Asia by sailing west. As November of 1492 arrived, Columbus's expedition faced the growing disparity between expectations and reality. The navigator had spent over a month exploring the Caribbean islands, encountering friendly indigenous peoples and documenting numerous species of plants and animals unknown to European science, yet he had found no evidence of the great cities, extensive trade networks, or fabulous wealth that medieval accounts attributed to the Indies and Cathay. The expedition's exploration of Cuba proved particularly challenging to Columbus's theories. The island's extensive coastline and numerous bays suggested a landmass of considerable size, possibly the mainland of Asia itself. However, repeated attempts to locate the Great Khan's court or any substantial cities yielded only indigenous villages, though these settlements demonstrated sophisticated agricultural techniques and complex social organizations that impressed the European observers. Columbus dispatched several reconnaissance missions inland, hoping to discover evidence of the advanced Asian civilization described in the accounts of Marco Polo and other medieval travelers. Luis de Torres, the expedition's interpreter who spoke Hebrew and Arabic, led one such mission with the expectation of communicating with Asian merchants or officials. Instead, the reconnaissance party encountered indigenous peoples who had never heard of the Great Khan and who possessed no knowledge of the vast trade networks that connected Asian cities. The search for gold became increasingly urgent as the expedition's timeline extended beyond original projections. The Spanish crown had invested significant resources in the voyage, and Columbus needed to demonstrate tangible returns to justify continued support for his theories. At future expeditions, the small amounts of gold jewelry worn by indigenous peoples provided tantalizing evidence of larger deposits, but locating the sources of this precious metal proved elusive. Indigenous informants, communicating through gestures and the few words of their languages that the Spanish had learned, indicated that larger quantities of gold could be found on an island to the southeast. They called this island Bohio, describing it as mountainous and inhabited by people who possessed substantial amounts of the precious metal. Columbus interpreted these accounts as possible references to the golden cities of Asia and decided to investigate this promising lead. The expedition's exploration of the Caribbean continued through November, with the three ships navigating among numerous islands while searching for evidence of Asian civilization. Each landfall brought new encounters with indigenous peoples, exchanges of gifts, and collection of plant and animal specimens, but no discovery of the wealthy cities that Columbus had promised his royal sponsors, according to records preserved in the archive of the Indies in Seville. The expedition's supplies were beginning to show signs of depletion by late November. The tropical climate had affected some of the stored provisions, and the extended timeline of the voyage was consuming resources faster than originally anticipated. Columbus faced pressure to demonstrate significant discoveries before returning to Spain, or risk being dismissed as a failure whose theories about reaching Asia had proved incorrect. On December the 6th, Columbus's fleet reached the large island that indigenous peoples called Haiti, which the navigator renamed Hispaniola in honor of Spain. This island appeared to offer the best prospects for finding substantial gold deposits and perhaps evidence of more advanced indigenous civilizations. The mountainous terrain and numerous rivers suggested geological conditions favorable for gold formation, while the size of the island promised extensive territories to explore. The expedition's encounters with the indigenous peoples of Hispaniola revealed a more complex political situation than they had encountered on smaller islands. The island was divided among several caciques, or chiefs, who controlled different territories and maintained varying relationships with their neighbors. Some of these leaders commanded considerable numbers of warriors and demonstrated political sophistication that impressed the Spanish observers. Columbus established his base of operations on the northern coast of Hispaniola, constructing a temporary settlement that would serve as headquarters for exploration of the island's interior. The indigenous peoples of this region, led by a cacique named Guacanagari, proved remarkably welcoming to the Spanish visitors, providing food, shelter, and guides for inland expeditions while demonstrating genuine curiosity about European technology and customs. The navigator's correspondence with the Spanish court during this period reveals his continuing conviction that he had reached the outer territories of Asia, despite the accumulating evidence that suggested otherwise. His reports emphasized the potential for finding gold and other valuable resources, while describing the indigenous peoples as gentle and easily converted to Christianity, laying the groundwork for future Spanish colonial activities in the region. The stage was set for the next phase of European exploration and colonization, though Columbus himself could not have foreseen the vast continental land masses that lay beyond the Caribbean islands or the complex civilizations that inhabited them. The fate of Columbus's expedition took a dramatic turn on Christmas Eve of 1492 when the Santa Maria, his flagship, ran aground on a coral reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola. The accident occurred during the night watch, when the helmsman had fallen asleep and the ship drifted onto the shallow reef. Despite desperate efforts to refloat the vessel, the Santa Maria suffered irreparable damage and had to be abandoned, leaving Columbus with only 2 ships for the return journey to Spain. The loss of the flagship created both crisis and opportunity for the expedition. The Santa Maria's timbers and supplies were salvaged to construct a fortified settlement, called La Navidad, the first European colony in the Americas. Columbus left 39 men at this settlement under the command of Diego de Arana, with instructions to continue searching for gold and to maintain friendly relations with the indigenous peoples while awaiting his return. With additional ships and supplies, Cacique Guacanagari and his people provided crucial assistance during the crisis, helping to save the Santa Maria's cargo and offering friendship to the Spanish colonists who would remain on the island. This cooperation reinforced Columbus's belief that the indigenous peoples could be valuable allies in Spanish colonial enterprises, though the cultural misunderstandings that would later lead to conflict were already beginning to emerge. With the Nina and Pinta loaded with specimens, gold samples, and several indigenous people who had agreed to accompany the expedition to Spain, Columbus began the return voyage on January the 16th, 1493. The 2 small ships faced the daunting prospect of crossing the Atlantic during winter months, when storms and adverse winds made the journey particularly hazardous. The return voyage proved far more challenging than the westward crossing had been. The ships encountered severe storms that separated them for several days, testing the navigational skills of both Columbus and Martin Alonso Pinzon. The Nina, carrying Columbus, was forced to seek shelter in the Azores, where Portuguese authorities initially detained the Spanish explorer before allowing him to continue his journey. As documented in contemporary Portuguese records, Columbus's unexpected arrival in the Azores created considerable diplomatic tension. The Portuguese had been pursuing their own route to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope, and the Spanish claims of having reached the Indies by sailing west threatened to upset the delicate balance of exploration rights between the 2 maritime powers. The final leg of the return journey brought Columbus to the Portuguese port of Lisbon in early March of 1493, where he received an audience with King John II. The Portuguese monarch, who had previously rejected Columbus's theories, now faced the uncomfortable reality that his rival had apparently succeeded in reaching Asian territories by the western route that Portugal had dismissed as impossible. Columbus's arrival in Spain on March the 15th, 1493, created a sensation throughout the kingdom. The navigator brought with him living proof of his discoveries, indigenous peoples from the islands. He had explored exotic birds and plants unknown to European science, and samples of gold that suggested the existence of much larger deposits. In the new territories, the Spanish court received Columbus with unprecedented honors, confirming his titles as Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of the Indies. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had listened with fascination to his accounts of the journey and his descriptions of the lands and peoples he had encountered. The success of the expedition vindicated their decision to support Columbus's theories and promised substantial returns on their investment. The publication of Columbus's letter describing his discoveries spread rapidly throughout Europe. Translated into multiple languages and distributed in numerous editions, this document, one of the first printed accounts of the New World, created widespread excitement about the possibilities for exploration, trade, and colonization in the newly discovered territories. The impact of Columbus's voyage extended far beyond the immediate territorial gains for Spain. The successful Atlantic crossing proved that the ocean sea could be navigated safely, opening the way for subsequent expeditions that would explore and map the entire Western Hemisphere. The encounter between European and indigenous peoples initiated a process of cultural exchange, conflict, and transformation that would reshape both continents. Within a decade of Columbus's return, Spanish expeditions had established permanent settlements throughout the Caribbean, explored the coasts of Central and South America, and made contact with advanced indigenous civilizations including the Aztec and Inca empires. The age of exploration that began with 3 small ships departing from Palos had evolved into a global enterprise that would ultimately connect all inhabited continents. Through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The consequences of that October morning in 1492, when Rodrigo de Triana first sighted land, continued to unfold for centuries afterward. As European exploration expanded to encompass the entire globe, and as the civilizations of the Old and New Worlds adapted to their new reality of permanent contact, Columbus's voyage had indeed altered human history, though in ways that neither the navigator nor his royal sponsors could have imagined when they first agreed to test the theory that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the ocean sea.